Rotherhithe, London, 7th September 1940, shortly after 5 in the afternoon. Station Officer Jerry Knight, London Fire Brigade, was looking at the Surrey commercial docks from ground level, and the docks were not burning the way a single warehouse burns. Timber stacks the size of streets were alight along both banks. Rubber stores were producing a smoke column that would later be visible from the coast of France. He had pumps working the perimeter, and he did not have enough of them, and he knew it in the time it took to look from the north quay to the south one. What Knight sent back to the alarm office that evening survives in the fire brigade's own records. A request for every pump that could be spared, because, in his own words, kept short, the whole bloody world's on fire. It was not an exaggeration written for effect. It was an operational assessment from an officer who had fought dock fires before and had never seen one that covered this much ground at once. By the following dawn, close to 1,000 pumps were drawing water from the Thames along that stretch of river. 19 fires had joined into full conflagrations. 17 more stood as major fires in their own right. Knight had asked for every pump in London because the docks were telling him in the first minutes that this was not a fire a normal attendance would hold. And the AFS crews arriving that night, most of them a matter of weeks out of training, were about to learn what a dock fire actually was. What did Station Officer Knight see in those first minutes at Surrey commercial docks that made him ask for every pump London had? And what did the newly formed Auxiliary Fire Service, only months into existence, actually have to send him? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. The Auxiliary Fire Service that Station Officer Knight was drawing on that night had existed in any organised form for barely 2 years. The Fire Brigades Act of January 1938 had authorised it, and the Home Office had begun issuing trailer pumps into 1940. Pumps that, in most of the country, arrived with no vehicle built to tow them. In London, the solution was pragmatic rather than elegant. Roughly 2,000 London taxis were requisitioned, their rear seats stripped out to carry a small crew and the hose that would normally have sat in the boot, a short ladder lashed to the roof. It was not a fire engine built for the job. It was a fire engine assembled from whatever the city already had. The regular London Fire Brigade of 1940 numbered around 2,500 officers and men. Standing behind them, by September of that year, were roughly 28,000 auxiliary firemen and women, most recruited from trades that had nothing to do with fire: clerks, drivers, tailors, and trained in weeks rather than years. The AFS classified its people by what they could physically do. Class B handled general firefighting duties. B1s worked ground-level pump operation and driving. Others were assigned to river service on the Thames, and messengers under 18 carried word between crews on bicycles and motorcycles when telephone lines went down. Full-time auxiliary firemen were paid £3 a week. Women who staffed control rooms, drove petrol vans and rode as dispatch messengers but did not fight fires directly were paid £2. An AFS crew towing a trailer pump behind a requisitioned taxi could deliver water onto a fire within minutes of arrival, provided the crew reached a usable hydrant or a stretch of riverbank the pump could suction from. What the taxi and trailer combination could not do was hold ground against a fire the size of the Surrey docks blaze on its own. A first-generation auxiliary fireman, weeks out of training, had the equipment to get water moving. What he did not yet have, what nobody in September 1940 yet had, was a body of experience for what an incendiary raid on this scale actually did to a city. If you served with the Auxiliary Fire Service, the National Fire Service, or the wartime London Fire Brigade, or your family did, tell us the station or division in the comments. The next video in this series follows what happened to that same wartime knowledge when the National Fire Service was broken back up into local brigades in 1948. Back at the appliance. Before you can understand why Knight needed 1,000 pumps rather than 30, you need to understand what a London dock shed and a city warehouse actually were as fire risks in 1940. These were timber-floored open bay structures, often built shoulder to shoulder along the river, holding cargo that had come across the Atlantic under threat of U-boat attack. Rubber, timber, grain, paper, chemicals, paint, spirits. A dock shed fire did not behave like a house fire. It behaved like a fuel store. Because that was, functionally, what it was. The incendiary bomb was built to exploit exactly this. Roughly 12 inches by 3, packed with magnesium, each bomber carried around 180 of them. A single incendiary would not bring down a warehouse. What it did was start a fire in a building that, once alight, could not be reached fast enough by a fire brigade sized for peacetime call volumes. In the raids of autumn 1940, brigades in London were recorded attending numbers of fires that ran into the thousands within a matter of weeks, closer to 10,000 attendances in the first several weeks of the Blitz alone. That was the arithmetic Knight's request for pumps was answering. Not one dock fire, but dozens, ignited simultaneously in buildings designed by their contents to burn hard once they caught. An experienced dockside officer, reading a timber stack fire from ground level, was reading something a peacetime warehouse fire officer rarely had to consider. The fire's ability to jump from stack to stack across open yards, and the fact that a shed built shoulder to shoulder with its neighbor gave a fire lateral movement a detached building never offered. What Knight's pumps were fighting for that night was not the individual shed. It was the gap between sheds, the space a fire crossed if nobody held it there. What did the construction of London's riverside warehouses and dock sheds, timber floors, open bays, buildings set close together, tell an experienced fire officer about how fast a single incendiary strike could become a conflagration? And what did that mean for how many pumps a single dockside raid actually required? The Surrey Docks fire on the opening night was not an isolated test. It was the first demonstration of a problem that would repeat for 57 consecutive nights. London's brigades, regular and auxiliary combined, were built around peacetime call volumes, and the Luftwaffe's incendiary raids were designed specifically to exceed whatever capacity any single city's fire service held in reserve. The response that emerged was the column move, pre-planned convoys of pumps brought in from outer London and surrounding counties, sent toward the district under the heaviest attack rather than toward any single address. This worked within limits the brigades learned as they went. Coordinating regular LFB officers, London AFS auxiliaries with a few months' service, and reinforcing pumps arriving from counties whose crews did not know London's streets, its hydrant positions, or its water main layout, was itself an operational problem nobody had rehearsed at this scale before September 1940. A pump crew from outside London, arriving at a dockside fire in the dark with the usual street signage removed for wartime security, depended entirely on a London-based officer's local knowledge to be positioned usefully at all. What the raids exposed within weeks was that command and water supply were the two constraints that decided whether a column move actually held a fire or simply arrived to watch it burn. Neither could be solved by courage. Both had to be solved by organization, and by August 1941, the decision to unify every regular and auxiliary brigade in the country into a single national fire service was, in large part, an answer to exactly this problem. That mutual aid without standardized command, standardized equipment, and shared operational knowledge was reaching its limit before that first winter of raids was even over. What did the difficulty of coordinating reinforcing pumps from outside London, crews unfamiliar with the streets, the hydrants, and the water mains of a city under attack, reveal about the limits of mutual aid in the first months of the Blitz? And what problem was the National Fire Service, formed in August 1941, actually built to solve? The City of London, 29 December 1940, shortly after 6 in the evening. The raid that followed would be called, within days, the Second Great Fire of London, by a foreign correspondent filing copy back to his office. And the comparison was not sentiment. 136 bombers dropped roughly 100,000 incendiary bombs and close to 100 tons of high explosive onto a compact square mile of medieval streets, livery halls, and wren churches, most of them locked and unwatched because it was a Sunday evening and the fire watcher's order did not cover every building in the district. What made that night different from September was not the bomb count. It was what the bombs met when they landed. 3 36-inch water mains and 12 smaller ones were fractured early in the raid, and the Thames, the emergency water source pump crews had counted on since the docks fires in September, was at one of the lowest tides of the year. Hoses drawing suction from the riverbank pulled up foreshore mud instead of water. Roughly 2,000 pumping appliances from London and over 300 more from outside the city worked that night, and even at that scale, major conflagrations were absorbing 30 or more pumps each, while craters and rubble closed roads to the appliances still trying to reach them. 14 firefighters did not survive that night. St. Paul's Cathedral did in large part because a dedicated watch had stockpiled water in whatever containers they could find in the weeks before, understanding correctly that the mains might fail exactly when they were needed most. The lesson the brigades carried out of the Second Great Fire of London was not about courage. It was about water, that a city's fire brigades could not depend on mains and a tidal river as their only supply, and that the raids yet to come would need a supply system the December raid had shown, in the plainest possible terms, did not yet exist. What did the failure of London's water mains and the low Thames tide on the night of 29th of December 1940 teach fire brigades about the limits of relying on mains and river suction alone? And what water system would this lesson force into existence before the Blitz was over? For the people who lived and worked around the docks and the city that winter, the fire brigade was not a distant institution. It was the difference between a workplace and a home surviving the night or not. Dock workers at the Surrey commercial docks watched cargo their livelihoods depended on burn in front of them, while AFS crews worked the perimeter. Residents of Stepney, Suffolk and Bermondsey sheltered in underground stations and listened to fire bells above ground, returning at dawn not knowing whether their street would still be standing. The community's relationship to the fire brigade changed over those months in a way that was itself documented at the time. Before the war, London Fire Brigade Museum records note that auxiliary firemen had sometimes been regarded with suspicion, men considered too old or too young for military service, taking up a uniform without having gone to fight. That attitude changed once the Blitz began, and firefighters became known as the heroes with grimy faces. It was not a label the brigades sought. It was a description of what the public had actually watched happen, night after night, from the shelters and the street corners. What the community saw was specific. Petrol tankers driven by women through streets still burning to keep the pumps fueled. Messengers barely old enough to leave school carrying word between crews when the phone lines went down. A night watchman on a cathedral roof with a bucket and a stirrup pump, standing between an incendiary bomb and 800 years of building. None of it was dramatic in the moment it happened. It became significant only in retrospect, once the scale of what had been protected became clear. What did the sight of auxiliary firefighters, clerks, tailors, drivers, weeks out of training, holding a dockside or a city street through a raid change about how Londoners in Stepney, Southwark and the city understood the fire brigade protecting them? And what did that community trust actually rest on? The knowledge that London's fire brigades built during the Blitz was not free. Over the 8 months of sustained raids, more than 1,000 firefighters and firewomen across the country did not survive the incidents they attended, a toll recorded today on the National Firefighters Memorial near St. Paul's, close to where Station Officer Knight's own brigade had fought that first Surrey Docks fire. 14 of them died in the single night of the Second Great Fire of London alone. What the record does not describe, and what this channel will not invent, is which specific decision led to which specific death. What the record does show is the pattern behind the toll. Buildings whose structural condition was unknown after high explosive bombing, water supplies that failed mid-operation, exactly when a crew was committed inside, and raids that ran for consecutive nights, leaving even experienced regular officers operating on cumulative fatigue that the Fire Brigades Act had never anticipated when it set out peacetime watch rotations 2 years earlier. An auxiliary fireman, working his first winter of raids, was, in effect, building the operational knowledge that the National Fire Service would later depend on, in real time, at cost. There was no accumulated body of Blitz-specific experience to draw on in September 1940, because nobody in Britain had fought incendiary raids at this scale before. Every crew that attended the Surrey Docks Fire, the Second Great Fire of London, and the raids between them was generating that knowledge as it went. The water relay techniques, the column move coordination, the recognition that a bombed building could not be read, the way a peacetime fire officer had been trained to read one. That knowledge, once built, is what the National Fire Service inherited in August 1941. It did not arrive free of the 14 men who did not survive the night it was tested hardest. What does the fact that more than 1,000 British firefighters did not survive the Blitz, with no specific death here presented as a dramatized event, tell us about the price of the operational knowledge that the wartime fire service was building in real time, without precedent to draw on? On the 18th of August 1941, every regular brigade and every auxiliary fire service in Britain stopped existing as separate organisations and became the National Fire Service. It was not a ceremonial gesture. It was the direct institutional answer to what the Surrey Docks Fire, the raids that followed it, and the Second Great Fire of London had all demonstrated in their different ways. That mutual aid between independent brigades, however well-intentioned, could not by itself standardize equipment, coordinate command across boundaries, or guarantee that a crew from outside a city knew how to work inside it. Under the NFS, hose couplings, pump fittings, and radio call signs were standardized nationally for the first time, which meant a pump crew reinforcing a raid 200 miles from its home station could now connect its hose to another brigade's hydrant fitting without delay. Command structures were unified into fire forces and divisions that crossed the old borough and county boundaries the Blitz had shown to be an operational liability. The AFS designation itself was retired, not because the volunteers who had staffed it had failed, but because the emergency that had required an improvised taxi-towed weeks of training service was being answered, finally, by a permanent, trained, standing national force. What the NFS could not do was retroactively give September 1940's auxiliary firemen the years of building-specific experience that regular officers before the war had spent a career accumulating. What it did do was ensure that the knowledge the Blitz had cost, the water relay lessons of December, the column move coordination of the autumn raids, the recognition that bomb damage made a building unreadable by peacetime rules, was captured in standard operating procedure rather than lost each time a wartime volunteer went home when his service ended. What did the standardization of equipment, command, and procedure under the National Fire Service in August 1941 actually preserve from the operational knowledge the Blitz had cost? And what could it never give back to the men who had learned it under fire? If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more watch systems, more officers reading a building from the cab of a pump in the dark, and more lessons learned the hard way that were never written down until an organization like the NFS existed to write them down at all. An auxiliary fireman in September 1940 had, on average, a matter of weeks of training before he was towing a trailer pump through a raid. And what the Blitz taught him about a burning building, no manual had written down yet. And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a building, put it in the comments. If you or your family served with the Auxiliary Fire Service, the National Fire Service, or the wartime London Fire Brigade, tell us the division. The next video in this series follows what happened to that same wartime knowledge when the National Fire Service was broken back up into local brigades in 1948. Static water tanks, installed across London after mains failures like the one on 29th of December 1940, became a permanent fixture of British urban planning long after the raids ended. The 1947 Fire Services Act reorganised the national structure once more, this time back toward local authority control, carrying the NFS's standardized procedures into peacetime brigades. What the Blitz gave British firefighting: standardized equipment, unified command, and a body of operational knowledge about mass incendiary fire that no peacetime brigade had ever needed to hold before September 1940. What it took? More than 1,000 firefighters who did not live to see the National Fire Service they had, in effect, built through 8 months of raids. Firemen who learned at Surrey Docks and at the Second Great Fire of London lessons about water supply and building collapse that the fire service would spend the rest of the century applying, and that they themselves paid to learn in real time without precedent, because nobody in Britain had fought a war like this one before. The knowledge did not arrive free. It arrived because Station Officer Knight asked for every pump London had, and because the crews who answered that call kept coming back for 57 consecutive nights and the raids after them, until there was something worth standardizing at all.